At its peak, the British Empire controlled 1/4 of all the land on Earth and ruled over 500 million human beings. It had taken 3 centuries to build. It took 30 years to vanish. Between 1947 and 1980, colony after colony, continent after continent, broke free from London's grip in a cascade of independence that no one, not even Britain itself, fully saw coming. How does the largest empire in the history of the world simply dissolve? And what does it leave behind when it does? In this documentary, we'll trace the full arc of that dissolution, from the bloody trauma of Indian Partition to the last flags lowered across Africa, the Caribbean, and beyond, uncovering the forces, the failures, and the human costs that brought a world order to its end. In the years following the First World War, something extraordinary appeared on the maps hanging in schoolrooms across Britain. Colored in a familiar imperial red, the British Empire stretched across every continent, every ocean, every time zone on Earth. By 1920, it encompassed roughly 14 million square miles of territory, nearly 1/4 of the entire land surface of the planet. Somewhere within its borders, the sun was always rising. It was, by any measure, the largest empire in human history. The war had, paradoxically, made it larger still. Through the League of Nations mandate system, Britain absorbed vast new territories from the defeated powers. German East Africa became Tanganyika. Mesopotamia and Palestine, carved from the crumbling Ottoman Empire, fell under British administration. Southwest Africa passed to South African control under the British Crown. The architects of Versailles had, in their deliberations, handed London stewardship over millions of new subjects who had never been consulted on the matter. The numbers were staggering. Roughly 500 million people, 1 in 4 human beings alive on Earth, owed nominal allegiance to King George V. From the wheat fields of Canada to the tea gardens of Assam, from the gold mines of the Transvaal to the rubber plantations of Malaya, an intricate web of extraction and exchange fed the industrial heart of a small island nation off the northwestern coast of Europe. What held this impossible construction together? Partly the Royal Navy, whose fleets patrolled every major sea lane. Partly an elaborate administrative machinery, staffed by a surprisingly thin layer of British officials who governed enormous populations with remarkable confidence. But undergirding all of it was an ideology, a story the British told themselves with sincere conviction. They called it the civilizing mission. In drawing rooms and parliamentary debates alike, empire was justified not as conquest but as custodianship. Rudyard Kipling had given it memorable verse. Academics gave it pseudo-scientific dressing. The assumption of racial hierarchy, of a natural order in which Anglo-Saxon governance represented the pinnacle of human organization, was not a fringe position. It was the common sense of the age, shared across party lines and printed in textbooks given to children on 6 continents. The economic reality was rather less poetic. Colonial territories supplied raw materials at controlled prices, absorbed British manufactured goods under preferential trade arrangements, and provided investment returns that funded the comfortable lives of the British middle and upper classes. The relationship was profitable, and profitability required order, and order required the continuing belief that this arrangement was natural, permanent, and just. Yet even in these years of apparent zenith, the foundations carried hidden fractures. In India, a lawyer trained in London, was organizing a movement of nonviolent resistance that would eventually shake the empire to its roots. The next 3 decades would reveal just how fragile that confident red wash of color truly was. The men who sailed and marched to Gallipoli, to the Somme, to Mesopotamia, did so under a simple understanding. They were fighting for the empire that claimed them. Nearly 1.5 million Indians bore arms for the British crown. Hundreds of thousands of Africans served as carriers and soldiers in campaigns across the continent. Australians died on Turkish beaches. Canadians suffocated in clouds of chlorine gas at Ypres. By 1918, the blood debt was enormous, and the colonial world expected something in return. What they received, in many cases, was disappointment sharpened into fury. The contradiction was almost too stark to ignore. Britain had fought, so the official story ran for the rights of small nations, for self-determination, for the dignity of peoples living under foreign domination. President Woodrow Wilson's language of national self-determination circled the globe. Colonial subjects heard it clearly. They simply could not understand why it apparently applied only in Europe. In the Punjab city of Amritsar on the 13th of April 1919, that contradiction turned to massacre. A crowd had gathered in the walled garden of Jallianwala Bagh for the festival of Baisakhi. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to open fire without warning. 379 people were killed in the official count, a number widely considered a significant underestimate. Dyer blocked the exits and continued firing until his ammunition ran low. He later described the action as a moral lesson. The moral lesson the Indian independence movement drew was a different one entirely. Jawaharlal Nehru would later write that Jallianwala Bagh made him understand, at a level beyond politics, that British rule rested ultimately on the barrel of a gun. Mahatma Gandhi, who had encouraged Indians to support the war effort just years earlier, began the sustained campaign of non-cooperation that would define the next generation of Indian politics. Closer to home, another empire was fracturing. Ireland had been governed from Westminster for over a century, yet the Easter Rising of 1916 had demonstrated that armed republicanism was not simply a nuisance, but a genuine revolutionary force. By 1919, guerrilla war had begun in earnest. The Irish Republican Army, under Michael Collins, fought the British state to a standstill through ambush and intelligence work. London's response, deploying the infamous Black and Tans who terrorized civilian populations, generated revulsion even within Britain itself. The Anglo-Irish Treaty of December 1921 created the Irish Free State, partitioning the island and leaving 6 counties of Ulster within the United Kingdom. It was Britain's first significant territorial retreat in the modern era, a concession extracted by force, proving that sustained resistance could redraw imperial maps. The Statute of Westminster, passed in December 1931, formalized what geography and sacrifice had already demonstrated. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Irish Free State were recognized as fully autonomous nations, equal in status to Britain, bound only by a shared crown if they chose. The empire was quietly rebranding itself. The word Commonwealth began appearing with increasing frequency in official documents. The architecture of British global power had been redesigned without most people noticing. The dominions had graduated from subjects to partners, at least on paper. But for the vast millions in Africa and Asia who remained under direct colonial rule, no such renegotiation was on offer. The question now was whether those millions would accept that distinction indefinitely, or whether the arguments being sharpened in Delhi, in Nairobi, in the coffeehouses of Lagos, would eventually demand a different answer altogether. They would not accept it indefinitely. The 1920s and 30s would prove to be the years when rejection hardened into organization, when grievance became strategy. In India, the transformation was embodied in a single man with a spinning wheel and a handful of salt. Mohandas Gandhi had already demonstrated the power of non-cooperation in the early 1920s. But it was on the 12th of March, 1930, that he delivered his most theatrical and effective strike against British authority. He walked. For 24 days, Gandhi led a march of several dozen followers from his ashram in Sabarmati to the coastal village of Dandi, covering nearly 240 miles on foot. On April the 6th, he reached the sea, bent down, and picked up a small lump of salt-encrusted mud from the shore. In doing so, he violated the British salt laws, which prohibited Indians from collecting or selling salt without paying imperial taxes. The act was simple. Its implications were seismic. Within weeks, tens of thousands of Indians were making their own salt in deliberate defiance of the Raj. The British arrested over 60,000 people, including Gandhi himself. The world's press watched. Britain's moral authority, already weakened by Amritsar, drained a little further with every peaceful protester beaten by a lathi-wielding policeman. The Indian National Congress, under Gandhi's moral leadership and Nehru's political organization, had become something the British could no longer dismiss as a fringe agitation. It was a mass movement drawing in peasants, lawyers, merchants, and students. London's response was the Government of India Act of 1935, a document of enormous length and careful limitation. It offered provincial self-government while keeping defense and foreign affairs firmly in British hands. The Congress called it inadequate. The British called it generous. Both were, in their own way, correct. Across Africa and Southeast Asia, the seeds of organized resistance were germinating, if not yet flowering with the same intensity. In West Africa, educated elites who had studied in London and Paris returned home carrying new vocabularies of rights and self-determination. The National Congress of British West Africa, formed in 1920, brought together representatives from Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, and Gambia. They did not yet demand independence. They demanded representation, an African voice in the governance of African affairs. London granted almost nothing but noted with unease that the conversations were happening. Meanwhile, a more radical intellectual current was developing in the drawing rooms and lecture halls of London and Harlem. Pan-Africanism, shaped by thinkers like Marcus Garvey and the Trinidadian intellectual George Padmore, argued that the problems of African peoples across the world shared a common root in colonial domination. The Fifth Pan-African Congress was still a decade away, but the ideas that would animate it were already circulating, making empire a subject of philosophical challenge, not just political petition. In Burma, in Malaya, in the Gold Coast, young men joined organizations that met quietly and talked about futures their colonial rulers had not designed for them. London looked at all of this and reached, broadly speaking, for the instrument of limited reform. Constitutional concessions, carefully calibrated to satisfy moderate voices while containing radical ones. It was a strategy that had worked after a fashion in Ireland. It had partially worked with the Dominions. Whether it would hold in Asia and Africa was a question British officials preferred not to examine too closely. The storm was gathering. most in Whitehall believed they had time to manage it. They did not yet understand that the Second World War was about to tear away the last comfortable illusion that the empire could be reformed slowly and on British terms. The comfortable illusions of Whitehall did not survive the winter of 1942. Britain entered the Second World War already stretched, already indebted from the first, already governing an empire whose populations were asking questions London struggled to answer. The war did not create the empire's weakness. It exposed it with brutal and irreversible clarity. For the first 2 years, the empire held together through habit and hierarchy. Soldiers from India, Africa, Australia, and the Caribbean shipped out under British command to fight in North Africa and Europe. More than 2.5 million Indians alone would serve in uniform, the largest volunteer army in history. They fought with distinction. They were fighting, their officers told them, for freedom and civilization. Then came Singapore. On the 15th of February, 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered the island fortress to Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita. Around 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops laid down their arms, the largest surrender in British military history. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. He was not wrong. The shock was not merely strategic. It was psychological and political. Britain had told its Asian subjects for generations that the empire existed to protect them, that British power was unchallengeable, that the white man's authority rested on genuine military superiority. Singapore demolished that story in a single afternoon. If the great fortress could fall, what exactly was the empire's promise worth? Across Asia, the answer was being quietly filed away. The same year, on the other side of the subcontinent, a catastrophe unfolded that would scar India's memory of British rule permanently. The Bengal Famine of 1943 killed between 2 and 3 million people, with some estimates reaching considerably higher. Rice supplies were disrupted by war. Speculation and hoarding drove prices beyond reach. Churchill's wartime cabinet, prioritizing military supplies and exports to other territories, declined to divert adequate food shipments to the dying province. When appeals were made to London, Churchill reportedly asked why Gandhi had not yet died. Bengal starved. The moral accounting of empire grew heavier with every corpse. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a different kind of damage was being written into official documents. In August of 1941, Churchill and American President Franklin Roosevelt met aboard warships in Placentia Bay, Newfoundland. The Atlantic Charter they signed together committed both nations to respecting the right of all peoples to choose their own form of government. Roosevelt meant it to be universal. Churchill insisted it applied only to Nazi-occupied Europe. Colonial subjects read it differently. If self-determination was worth fighting for in Poland, why not in Nigeria? In Burma? In Jamaica? The contradiction was impossible to paper over, and colonial nationalist movements quoted the Atlantic Charter back to British officials for the next 2 decades. Britain's financial position told its own story of imperial decline. By the war's end, Britain was effectively bankrupt. The country had liquidated roughly £4 billion in overseas assets and accumulated debts that would take generations to repay. The 1945 loan from the United States, $4,337 million, came with conditions. It required the eventual convertibility of sterling and the opening of imperial trade networks that Britain had carefully protected for decades. American financial power was quietly dismantling the economic architecture of empire, even as British officials negotiated the terms. And the soldiers. The soldiers who had crossed oceans to fight fascism came home transformed. An Indian officer who had commanded men in the Western Desert or Burma had experienced authority, competence, and equality in ways that made colonial subordination feel not merely unjust but absurd. A West African soldier who had liberated European villages came home to find he still could not vote in his own country. The radicalization was not ideological in origin. It was personal, direct, and furious. Britain emerged from the Second World War victorious in name, but the victory had consumed the very resources and prestige that made empire possible. The question was no longer whether the empire would end. The question was how quickly and on whose terms. The answer would begin urgently in South Asia. The British people voted in July of 1945, and they stunned the world. Winston Churchill, the war's great hero, the man who had held the nation together through its darkest hours, was thrown out of office in a landslide. Clement Attlee's Labour Party won nearly 400 seats in the House of Commons. The message from British voters was unmistakable. They had won the war. Now they wanted something different from the peace. Attlee himself was everything Churchill was not. Quiet, precise, almost deliberately unimpressive in manner, he had spent the war years in Churchill's cabinet learning exactly how exhausted Britain truly was. He harbored no romantic illusions about imperial grandeur. Empire to Attlee was a practical question, not a sentimental one. What could Britain actually afford to hold? What was worth holding? These were the questions his government would be forced to answer, faster than anyone anticipated. The financial reality was suffocating. Britain emerged from the war owing enormous debts to countries across the empire and beyond, its gold reserves nearly gone, its export industries hollowed out by 6 years of military production. In 1946, Britain negotiated a loan of $3,750 million from the United States, with an additional $500 million from Canada. The terms were telling. The Americans insisted on the eventual free convertibility of sterling and the gradual dismantling of the imperial preference system that had protected British trade for decades. Washington was not dismantling the British Empire deliberately. It simply had no interest in preserving the economic architecture that made empire profitable. The effect was the same. American pressure came in ideological form as well. The United States had emerged from the war as the world's preeminent power, and its founding mythology was anti-colonial. Franklin Roosevelt had never hidden his distaste for European empires. Harry Truman's administration was somewhat less confrontational, but the underlying American position remained clear. A world of open markets and self-determining nations suited American interests far better than a world carved into European imperial preference zones. From the other direction came Soviet pressure of a very different kind. Moscow enthusiastically supported anti-colonial movements worldwide, not from any genuine commitment to liberation, but because colonial unrest weakened Western rivals. Independence movements from Malaya to West Africa found themselves navigating a Cold War in which both superpowers, for entirely different reasons, questioned Britain's right to rule. And then there was the United Nations, established in San Francisco in 1945. The new organization enshrined self-determination as a foundational principle of international order. It created a trusteeship council to oversee colonial territories. It provided nationalist movements with a global stage and a legitimate vocabulary. Within its chambers, Britain would find itself repeatedly on the defensive, justifying arrangements that the new international consensus increasingly refused to accept. Attlee's government understood the situation with clear eyes. Britain could not simultaneously rebuild a shattered domestic economy, maintain a global military presence, and suppress the independence movements now accelerating across Asia and Africa. Something had to give. The question of India, already urgent, would become the first and most decisive test of whether Britain could manage retreat with any grace at all. The answer would arrive with remarkable speed, and with consequences that neither Attlee nor anyone in Whitehall fully anticipated. By the beginning of 1946, India was not waiting for British decisions. It was making them irrelevant. Naval mutinies shook Bombay in February, with raidings across the Royal Indian Navy raising the flags of Congress, the Muslim League, and the Communist Party together. Strikes paralyzed Calcutta. In the countryside, the authority of the Raj had thinned to something almost ceremonial. The question facing Attlee's government was no longer whether Britain would leave India. It was whether Britain could manage to leave it intact. The cabinet mission, dispatched in the spring of 1946, represented London's final attempt to transfer power without partition. 3 cabinet ministers, including Secretary of State Lord Pethick Lawrence, spent months in negotiations, eventually proposing a federated India with a weak center and substantial provincial autonomy. For a brief, fragile moment, it seemed possible. Both the Indian National Congress and Muhammad Ali Jinnah's Muslim League gave qualified acceptance to the plan. Then the fragile moment shattered. Jawaharlal Nehru, Congress's incoming president, gave a press conference in July suggesting his party would not feel bound by the mission's constraints once in power. Jinnah heard in those words exactly what he feared most, that Congress would use its parliamentary majority to absorb and ultimately dominate Muslim interests. He withdrew the League's acceptance and called for Direct Action Day in August. What followed in Calcutta was catastrophic. 4 days of communal violence left roughly 5,000 people dead in the streets. The cabinet mission plan died with them. Into this accelerating crisis walked Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas Mountbatten, appointed viceroy in February of 1947. He was 46 years old, supremely confident, possessed of a talent for personal diplomacy that bordered on manipulation, and given a mandate that would have paralyzed a more cautious man. Attlee's government had announced that Britain would leave India no later than June of 1948. Mountbatten arrived convinced even that deadline was too leisurely. He moved with extraordinary speed. Within weeks of his arrival, meeting individually with Nehru, Jinnah, and other leaders, Mountbatten concluded that partition was unavoidable. Jinnah would accept nothing less than a separate Muslim homeland. Nehru, despite his deepest instincts, ultimately accepted that a united India held together by force was worse than a divided India achieved by consent. In June of 1947, Mountbatten announced the plan. India would be partitioned. 2 nations would emerge. And the date of transfer was moved forward, dramatically, to August of that same year. The man given the near impossible task of actually drawing the border was Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer who had never previously set foot in India. He was given 5 weeks. Working from maps and census data, he divided Punjab and Bengal along lines that cut through villages, farms, railway lines, and ancient communities. When his award was announced, roughly 14.5 million people began moving across those lines in both directions, the largest forced migration in recorded history. In the violence that accompanied it, estimates of the dead range from 200,000 to over 1 million. At midnight on August 14, 1947, transferring into the 15th, Nehru rose before the Constituent Assembly in Delhi and spoke words that would echo for generations. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. Across a freshly drawn border, Pakistan had already been declared the day before, its founder Jinnah serving as Governor General of a nation born in crisis, its western and eastern wings separated by 1,000 miles of Indian territory. The jewel that had justified an empire, the prize that had drawn merchants and conquerors for 3 centuries, was gone in a matter of weeks. Britain had lost not merely a territory, but the entire rationale around which its global power had been organized. What remained, stretching across Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean, now had to be reconsidered. If India could go, if the empire's heart could simply stop beating, then what exactly was left worth holding? The borders were drawn. The flags were raised. And then came the killing. Cyril Radcliffe had never visited India before his appointment, and he left immediately after delivering his award, never returning. He reportedly burned his papers and declined his fee. Whether from guilt or simple discomfort, the man who divided a civilization wanted no further association with what his lines had produced. He would live until 1977, rarely speaking publicly about those 5 weeks. What his pencil marks unleashed defies easy comprehension. In Punjab alone, communities that had lived alongside one another for generations collapsed into something ancient and terrible almost overnight. Sikh, Hindu, and Muslim neighbors became killers and victims in patterns that followed no logic except fear and revenge. Trains crossed the new border carrying the dead rather than the living. Passengers slaughtered in their compartments and the carriages simply sent onward. Entire villages were burned. Women were abducted or killed by their own families to prevent capture. The violence was intimate in the way that only violence between neighbors can be. Between 10 and 20 million people were uprooted in the span of weeks. Columns of refugees stretched for miles along roads that had no proper infrastructure to support them. Cholera, dysentery, and exhaustion killed those whom blades had missed. Conservative estimates place the death toll at around 1 million. Some historians argue it reached 2 million. The precise figure will never be known, because no one with authority was counting. Where was Britain in all of this? Mountbatten, still serving as Governor General of the new India, later insisted that faster independence had saved lives by preventing a longer civil war. It is an argument that has aged poorly. The speed of the transfer, accelerated by more than 9 months from the original deadline, meant that British troops were withdrawing precisely as the violence was peaking. The boundary force established to maintain order in Punjab numbered only 50,000 soldiers for a region containing tens of millions of displaced people. It was disbanded by late September, overwhelmed and inadequate almost from its first day. The British government in London watched from a careful distance. Attlee's cabinet received reports of the massacres but made no significant effort to intervene, deploy resources, or accept the moral weight of what its century of divide and rule governance had helped produce. The partition, in official British framing, was presented as an orderly transfer of power between mature successor states. The rivers of refugees and the burning villages existed in a different narrative, one Britain preferred not to author. The consequences did not stay confined to 1947. The refugees who survived carried their displacement into the political DNA of both new nations. Pakistan's instability, its early loss of Jinnah to illness in 1948, its unresolved identity as a nation built around religion rather than ethnicity or geography, all flowed directly from the trauma of those first weeks. India absorbed millions of Hindu and Sikh refugees from the West, their bitterness shaping Hindu nationalist politics for decades to come. And Kashmir, princely state with a Muslim majority and a Hindu ruler, was never resolved at all. It became the wound that both nations pressed rather than healed, the source of wars in 1947, 1965, and 1999, and an active nuclear flashpoint in the present day. The subcontinent had paid an extraordinary price for freedom, and the bill had been presented not by the nationalists who sought independence, but by the manner in which it was granted. Speed without preparation, borders without understanding, withdrawal without accountability. In London, the focus was already shifting. India had consumed British imperial imagination for so long that its loss left a kind of administrative vertigo. But the empire was far from finished. Across Africa, tens of millions of people remained under British authority, their own nationalist movements watching what had happened in South Asia with intense interest. If the largest, wealthiest, most strategically vital possession could be surrendered in weeks, the logic of holding anywhere else required a new and more honest examination. The age of reluctant retreats was only just beginning. Palestine in the late 1940s was a territory held together by little more than British exhaustion and borrowed time. The mandate had been a promise made to two peoples simultaneously, and Britain was discovering, with painful clarity, that such promises could not survive contact with reality. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 had expressed British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Arab leaders had received their own wartime assurances. By 1945, both communities wanted the same land, and Britain was caught between them with no workable solution and dwindling patience for the cost of occupation. The returning Jewish survivors of the Holocaust had not softened the urgency of Zionist ambitions. They had sharpened them. Underground militant organizations, principally the Irgun under Menachem Begin and the Stern Gang, concluded that British presence was the obstacle to statehood and began treating it accordingly. In July 1946, Irgun operatives detonated explosives hidden in the basement of Jerusalem's King David Hotel, which housed British military headquarters. 91 people died, among them British officers, Arab workers, and Jewish civilians. The blast tore through the southern wing in seconds, and the rubble took days to fully clear. It was the deadliest single attack on British forces since the end of the war. How should a global empire respond when the people it governs begin killing its administrators? Increased repression risked American condemnation at precisely the moment Britain depended on American financial support. Significant troop deployments drained a treasury already emptied by 6 years of war. The Attlee government authorized searches, detention camps, and a naval blockade to prevent Jewish immigration ships from landing, producing images of Holocaust survivors being turned away from shore at gunpoint. The political damage was considerable and the military effect minimal. Arab leaders offered no easier path. Any partition that created a Jewish state was, for them, categorically unacceptable. Britain had neither the energy nor the political capital to impose a solution on both populations simultaneously. In February 1947, Bevan handed the problem to the United Nations. It was less a decision than a confession. Britain had run out of answers, and the emerging international body was invited to supply what empire no longer could. The United Nations Special Committee on Palestine recommended partition in the autumn of that year, dividing the territory into separate Arab and Jewish states, with Jerusalem under international administration. The General Assembly approved the plan in November 1947. Britain, the administering power, abstained from the vote entirely, a remarkable acknowledgement that it would neither endorse the outcome nor take responsibility for implementing it. The withdrawal was set for May 14, 1948. British forces did not oversee any handover. They simply left, turning in their keys and boarding their ships while the two communities they had governed for 30 years began fighting in earnest. Within hours of the last British High Commissioner departing, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the State of Israel. Within hours of that proclamation, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon sent armies across the border. The Arab-Israeli War had begun. Britain watched from the outside, having ensured, through its abstention and its abrupt departure, that whatever emerged from the conflict would be built without its oversight or its blessing. Palestine joined India and Pakistan on the growing list of territories where British withdrawal had been followed immediately by mass violence. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Speed, ambiguity, and unresolved competing claims had become the signature of British imperial exit. The question was whether anyone in London would acknowledge the pattern or simply continue moving to the next departure. Across Africa, that question was becoming urgent. If Palestine had demonstrated the violence of contested withdrawal, the months immediately following offered a different lesson. Some departures, it turned out, could happen quickly, and some corners of the empire were simply allowed to leave. Burma had been administered from British India since the 1880s, a vast territory of rice paddies, teak forests, and river deltas stretching from the Bay of Bengal toward the Chinese interior. During the Second World War, Japanese forces had swept through the country, and many Burmese nationalists had initially welcomed them as liberators. Aung San, the young general who led the Burma National Army, had trained with Japanese officers before switching sides as Allied victory became inevitable. By 1947, he had become the indispensable figure in negotiations with the Attlee government, the one leader capable of holding the fragile coalition of Burmese ethnic groups together. In January of that year, Aung San traveled to London and secured an agreement for full independence within 12 months. The future seemed, against considerable odds, manageable. Then, in July 1947, a political rival arranged his murder. Gunmen burst into a cabinet meeting in Rangoon and killed Aung San along with 6 of his ministers. He was 32 years old. The man who might have guided Burma through its transition was gone before independence had even arrived. His successors pressed forward regardless, and on the 4th of January 1948, Burma became an independent republic, choosing notably not to join the Commonwealth. The British flag came down quietly. The civil wars that followed within months, as ethnic minorities and communist factions challenged the new government, were Burma's alone to fight. Ceylon offered a sharper contrast. The island colony had developed a stable, educated political class through decades of relatively cooperative administration, and its transition required nothing like the agonies of Palestine or the violence surrounding Burma. On the 4th of February 1948, Ceylon became a self-governing dominion within the Commonwealth, its transfer of power completed without a single notable incident of bloodshed. Prime Minister D.S. Senanayake had negotiated patiently, and Britain had, for once, departed gracefully. The broader tide across Asia was unmistakable. The Dutch were fighting a losing war to hold Indonesia. The French were already mired in Indochina, facing a communist insurgency that would consume them for another 7 years. Every colonial power in Asia was discovering the same essential truth. The legitimacy that empire had once claimed for itself had been spent in the years between 1939 and 1945. The war had required Asian populations to sacrifice enormously. The promise, implicit or explicit, was that such sacrifice would be rewarded. Asia was collecting on that promise, colony by colony. The question that now pressed on British strategists and politicians alike was whether the same reckoning was coming for Africa, and whether anything could be done to manage its arrival on more favorable terms. Not every retreat from empire happened in the quiet manner of Ceylon. In the dense jungle interior of Malaya, Britain fought one of the longest and most brutal counterinsurgency campaigns of the 20th century, a conflict that lasted 12 years and raised uncomfortable questions about exactly what managed withdrawal was willing to cost. The Malayan Communist Party, drawing its membership almost entirely from the ethnic Chinese community, had spent the war years fighting Japanese occupation. They had done so with British support, receiving weapons and training from Allied forces. When the war ended, those weapons did not disappear. In June 1948, communist guerrillas, calling themselves the Malayan Races Liberation Army, began ambushing rubber planters and attacking colonial infrastructure. 3 European estate managers were murdered in Perak. Within weeks, the British colonial government declared a state of emergency. What followed was not a conventional war. The jungle swallowed entire battalions. Guerrilla fighters, perhaps 10,000 at their peak, melted between the trees and vanished into communities that supplied them with food, shelter, and information. British forces found themselves fighting an enemy that had no uniforms, no fixed positions, and no front line. The response was systematic and, in many respects, pitiless. In February 1950, Lieutenant General Harold Briggs arrived as Director of Operations with a plan that bore his name. The Briggs Plan identified the guerrillas' critical vulnerability, their dependence on rural Chinese squatter communities for supplies and recruits. The solution was forced relocation. Over the following years, roughly 500,000 people, many of whom had farmed the same land for decades, were uprooted and moved into newly constructed settlements surrounded by barbed wire and floodlights. These new villages, as they were called, were essentially controlled enclosures. Movement in and out was monitored. Food supplies were rationed to prevent smuggling to guerrillas. The human cost was immense. Families lost land, livelihoods, and autonomy overnight. But the strategy worked in military terms. By cutting the supply lines between fighters and civilians, British forces slowly starved the insurgency of its logistical foundations. Alongside this coercion ran what became known as hearts and minds, a phrase coined by General Gerald Templer, who arrived in 1952 with a reputation for both ruthlessness and political sophistication. Templer understood that military pressure alone could not win the conflict. Communities needed schools, clinics, and a stake in the future being promised. He offered the prospect of Malayan independence, making explicit that Britain was not fighting to preserve colonial rule indefinitely, but to ensure it ended on stable terms rather than in communist revolution. The combination proved effective, though never clean. Aerial bombardment stripped jungle canopy. Collective punishment fell on villages suspected of aiding guerrillas. The death toll among combatants and civilians accumulated across a decade of grinding operations. On the 31st of August, 1957, Malaya became independent, peacefully and within the Commonwealth framework. The emergency was formally declared over in 1960. Britain presented the outcome as a vindication, a model counterinsurgency that had succeeded where the French had failed in Indochina. But the model carried a troubling legacy. Independence had been granted, yes. It had also been managed, manipulated, and purchased at the cost of 500,000 displaced lives and a decade of organized violence. As the Union flag came down in Kuala Lumpur, British planners were watching a far larger challenge taking shape on a different continent entirely. Africa, with its vast territories, its complex colonial arrangements, and its swelling independence movements, would not wait much longer. Kenya told a different story. Not a managed withdrawal, not a careful transition, but something rawer and more revealing about what empire at its core had always required. The roots of conflict ran deep into the soil itself, literally. Since the early 20th century, British settlers had claimed the fertile highland regions of central Kenya, displacing the Kikuyu people from land their families had farmed for generations. By the 1940s, roughly 30,000 white settlers controlled millions of acres of the richest agricultural territory in East Africa. The Kikuyu, the largest ethnic group in Kenya, were pushed onto crowded reserves, forced to labor on farms that had once been their own, denied the right to grow profitable cash crops, and barred from meaningful political participation. Grievance accumulated across decades like pressure building beneath sealed ground. The movement that emerged called itself the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. The British called it Mau Mau, a term whose origin remains disputed but whose purpose was clear: to render the enemy strange, savage, and irrational. In October 1952, after a series of killings of Kikuyu loyalists and white settlers, the colonial government declared a state of emergency. Within days, Operation Jock Scott swept through Nairobi, arresting over 150 African political leaders in a single night. Among them was Jomo Kenyatta, the most prominent Kikuyu political figure in Kenya, who was convicted on disputed evidence of managing the uprising and sentenced to 7 years of hard labor. The British had removed their most credible African interlocutor at the precise moment when dialogue might have mattered most. What followed was a systematic campaign of detention and suppression that would take decades to fully reckon with. At its peak, the British administration held over 70,000 Kenyans in a network of detention camps stretching across the colony. The camps were not incidental to the counterinsurgency. They were central to it. The logic, developed under the clinical language of rehabilitation, held that detainees must be broken psychologically before they could be returned to colonial society. The breaking was literal. Detainees at camps including Hola and Manyani were beaten, starved, and subjected to what survivors described as systematic sexual violence. In March 1959, 11 detainees were beaten to death by guards at Hola camp. The colonial administration initially attempted to conceal the killings, claiming the men had drunk contaminated water. The lie collapsed under examination. Even then, accountability was minimal. The broader scale of atrocity took far longer to surface. In 2012, the British government faced a legal claim brought by elderly Kenyan survivors. What emerged from the subsequent proceedings was extraordinary. British officials had secretly shipped thousands of documents to the United Kingdom at independence in 1963, concealing evidence of systematic torture from the incoming Kenyan government. The documents discovered at a government facility in Hanslope Park revealed that the brutality in Kenya had not been the work of rogue officers. It had been sanctioned, organized, and deliberately hidden. In 2013, the British government offered a formal statement of regret and compensation to over 5,000 survivors. It stopped short of a full apology. For many of those survivors, now in their 80s and 90s, the acknowledgement came almost too late. Kenya had exposed something the Malayan narrative had partially obscured. The managed end of empire was not always managed. Sometimes it was defended with extraordinary violence until the cost of holding on finally outweighed the cost of leaving. That calculation was now being made simultaneously across an entire continent. And nowhere would it arrive more dramatically or more consequentially than in the territories where independence would not be quietly negotiated but loudly, collectively demanded. While Britain was confronting the uncomfortable realities of its African empire, a crisis was building thousands of miles away that would strip away, in a matter of weeks, any remaining illusion about where British power actually stood in the modern world. The Suez Canal was, in every sense, the artery of empire. Since its opening in 1869, the 193-kilometer waterway through Egyptian territory had carried British soldiers east and British trade west, connecting London to India, to Malaya, to Australia. Whoever controlled Suez controlled the jugular of British global reach. Everyone in Whitehall understood this. What they failed to understand was that the world had changed around them. On the 26th of July, 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser stood before a roaring crowd in Alexandria and announced that Egypt was nationalizing the Suez Canal. The canal's revenues, he declared, would fund the Aswan High Dam that Western powers had just refused to finance. The crowd's response was thunderous. Across the Arab world, Nasser became an instant hero. In London, Prime Minister Anthony Eden received the news at a dinner for the King of Iraq. His response was immediate and visceral. Nasser, Eden believed, was a new Hitler, and appeasement was not an option. What followed was one of the most disastrous miscalculations in British political history. Unable to act alone and unwilling to wait for diplomacy, Britain entered into a secret conspiracy. In late October, British, French, and Israeli officials met at a villa in Sèvres, outside Paris, and drafted what became known as the Protocol of Sèvres. The plan was breathtaking in its cynicism. Israel would invade the Sinai Peninsula. Britain and France would then issue an ultimatum demanding both sides withdraw from the Canal Zone. When Egypt inevitably refused, Anglo-French forces would intervene, ostensibly as peacekeepers, actually as conquerors. The collusion was to be kept absolutely secret. It was not kept secret. On the 29th of October, Israeli forces crossed into Sinai. British and French planes began bombing Egyptian airfields on the 31st. Paratroopers landed at Port Said on the 5th of November. The military operation was, by its own narrow measure, proceeding. Everything else was catastrophe. The United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to demand a ceasefire. The Soviet Union threatened rocket attacks on London and Paris. And most devastatingly, the United States, under President Dwight Eisenhower, was furious. Eisenhower, facing a presidential election, had not been consulted. He was not merely annoyed. He moved against Britain with the full weight of American financial power. The pound sterling was collapsing under speculative pressure. Britain desperately needed an emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund. Eisenhower made the American position plain: not $1 of support until Britain withdrew. Without American backing, the IMF loan was impossible. Without the loan, the British economy faced a genuine crisis. Aden folded. On the 7th of November, barely a week after the invasion began, Britain agreed to a ceasefire. The humiliation was total. Britain and France withdrew. The canal remained Egyptian. Nasser, far from being toppled, emerged as a towering symbol of Arab nationalism, his prestige immeasurably enhanced by having faced down two European empires and survived. Aden, his health shattered and his reputation destroyed, resigned in January 1957. He retreated to a life of almost deliberate obscurity. The official medical explanation was illness. The political reality was that he had led his country into a conspiratorial, illegal military adventure and been stopped by an ally more powerful than Britain had allowed itself to acknowledge. Suez did not end the British Empire. Territories and commitments remained. But it ended something perhaps more important: the psychological architecture on which imperial confidence had rested. Britain could no longer pretend, even to itself, that it operated independently of American permission. The decisions made in Washington now mattered more than those made in London. For colonial peoples watching from Africa and Asia, the lesson was equally clear. The empire's invincibility had been a performance all along. Now the curtain had fallen. What would follow? While Suez shattered British confidence from without, a different kind of revolution was already well underway on the shores of West Africa. And its architect was a man who had spent years preparing, organizing, and waiting for precisely this moment. Kwame Nkrumah had returned to the Gold Coast in 1949 armed with ideas sharpened by years of study in America and Britain. He had read Marcus Garvey and Wib Du Bois. He had attended the landmark Manchester Pan-African Congress of 1945, where African intellectuals gathered to declare that the age of colonial submission was finished. Nkrumah came home not merely as a politician, but as a movement. His Convention People's Party was something colonial Africa had rarely seen before, a genuinely mass organization. Where previous African political movements had drawn from educated elites, Nkrumah went to the markets, the docks, the farms. He gave speeches in the open air to thousands. He published newspapers. He organized boycotts. His slogan was as simple as it was electrifying: self-government now, not tomorrow, not after further preparation now. The British authorities were alarmed enough to arrest him in 1950 on charges of inciting illegal strikes. They believed imprisonment would quiet him. They misread the mood entirely. In February of 1951, the Gold Coast held its first elections under a new constitution granting limited self-government. The Convention People's Party won 34 of 38 contested seats. Nkrumah himself, still sitting in James Fort Prison, won his constituency by a margin that made the result impossible to ignore. The colonial governor, Sir Charles Arden Clarke, faced a straightforward choice. He could govern against the clearly expressed will of the population, or he could adapt. He adapted. Nkrumah was released from prison and driven directly to Government House. Within hours, the man who had been a prisoner was the leader of government business, soon to be confirmed as Prime Minister. The transformation was extraordinary. A man in prison clothes one day, a head of government the next. A compression of history into a single afternoon. The 6 years that followed were a careful negotiation. Nkrumah pushed steadily for full independence. The British, having absorbed the lessons of India and watching the deteriorating situation in Kenya and elsewhere, chose pragmatism. A fight in the Gold Coast offered no prize worth the cost. On the 6th of March 1957, a date Nkrumah had chosen deliberately, it was the anniversary of nothing British. Only of his own declaration, the Gold Coast ceased to exist. Ghana was born. The name was chosen from a great medieval West African empire, reaching back across centuries to claim a history far older than any colonial map. The independence celebrations in Accra drew representatives from across the world. The streets were thick with crowds. Nkrumah appeared before his people in the midnight darkness as the old flag came down, his voice breaking with emotion as he spoke the words, "Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever." For African nationalists from Nairobi to Lusaka to Lagos, the effect was electric. If the Gold Coast could do it, so could they. The psychological barrier, the assumption that independence was something granted gradually over generations, had been demolished. A black African nation had stood up and claimed its place in the world not through violence, but through organization, determination, and the sheer force of popular will. Nkrumah himself understood the moment's reach. "Our independence is meaningless," he declared, "unless it is linked up with the total liberation of Africa." The continent had been given both a blueprint and a rallying cry. And the British Empire, stretched thin across dozens of territories, would soon discover just how quickly that cry could travel. The cry traveled faster than anyone in Whitehall had anticipated. By 1959, it had reached a pitch impossible to ignore, and one man above all others was about to acknowledge what the maps in London's colonial offices still refused to show. Harold Macmillan was not a man given to dramatic gestures. The patrician conservative prime minister preferred understatement, the raised eyebrow over the clenched fist. But the tour he undertook through Africa in early 1960 convinced him of something that demanded plain speaking. On the 3rd of February 1960, he stood before the assembled Parliament of South Africa in Cape Town and delivered words that no British Prime Minister had ever said aloud. "The wind of change is blowing through this continent," Macmillan declared. "Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact." The silence in the chamber was instructive. His audience, the architects of apartheid, had expected a sympathetic ally. They received instead a diagnosis. Macmillan was telling them, and telling the world, that African nationalism was not a problem to be managed. It was a force of nature. But what had truly hardened British resolve before that speech was something far uglier, happening in a detention camp in Kenya called Hola. In March of 1959, 11 Mau Mau detainees were beaten to death by camp guards. The colonial authorities initially tried to claim the men had died drinking contaminated water. The lie collapsed almost immediately under examination. The Hola massacre landed in the House of Commons like a stone through glass. Even those who had supported firm measures in Kenya found themselves unable to defend what had happened. A young conservative MP named Enoch Powell delivered one of the most morally searing speeches the Commons had heard in years, demanding that Britain hold itself to a single standard of justice regardless of race or geography. If such acts could not be justified when committed by a British hand, he argued the entire premise of benevolent empire required examination. Macmillan drew his own conclusion from Hola, and it was coldly pragmatic. The choice facing Britain was not between order and chaos. It was between a managed, dignified withdrawal or a succession of dirty, expensive, reputation-destroying conflicts that Britain could not afford and could not win. The Treasury agreed. The soldiers were tired. The public was shifting. His answer was Ian MacLeod. Appointed colonial secretary in October of 1959, MacLeod arrived at the colonial office with a mandate to accelerate decolonization well beyond anything his predecessors had contemplated. Where previous secretaries had spoken of preparing colonies over decades for eventual self-government, MacLeod spoke in years, sometimes months. He had read the intelligence reports. He understood that the question was no longer whether African territories would become independent, but only how much damage would be done in the waiting. MacLeod moved with a speed that alarmed conservative backbenchers and stunned colonial governors in equal measure. Conferences were convened, constitutions were drafted, timetables were set that would have seemed fantastical just 5 years earlier. 1960 became known almost immediately as the Year of Africa. 17 African nations gained independence that single year, not all of them British, but the tide was unmistakable. In London's Colonial Office, the maps being redrawn were changing faster than the ink could dry. The empire that had taken centuries to assemble was now being systematically, deliberately, and with considerable political courage, dismantled within a single decade. The only question remaining was whether the pace MacLeod had set could hold and what would be left standing when it finally slowed. The pace did not slow. It accelerated. Nigeria went first, and nothing that followed would quite match the scale of that moment. On the 1st of October 1960, the most populous nation in Africa lowered the Union Jack and raised its own green and white flag before crowds that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Nigeria alone contained more people than all of Britain's remaining African territories combined. Its independence was not merely a political event. It was a demographic statement about who the empire had actually governed and what it had always been asking of them. The constitutional negotiations that produced Nigerian independence had taken years and left nobody entirely satisfied, which some observers took as proof they had been done correctly. The country was a federation of North and South, of Muslim and Christian, of Hausa and Yoruba and Igbo, of peoples whose boundaries had been drawn not by their own hands but by British administrators at the end of the 19th century. Everyone understood the tensions built into those borders. Everyone hoped, with varying degrees of sincerity, that the new institutions would hold them together. Sierra Leone followed in April of 1961, a quieter independence for a smaller colony, but one carrying its own particular weight. Freetown had been founded in 1787 as a settlement for freed slaves. That a colony born from the wreckage of the Atlantic slave trade should now govern itself carried a symbolism that required no commentary. Tanganyika became independent in December of that same year, led by Julius Nyerere, a former school teacher whose patient, principled approach to independence negotiations had impressed even those in the colonial office who had moved slowly to embrace MacLeod's timetable. Uganda followed in October of 1962, a country of ancient kingdoms and sharp ethnic loyalties that had required delicate constitutional balancing to bring to independence without immediate fracture. Critics in Britain, and there were genuine critics beyond the usual imperial diehards, asked uncomfortable questions. Were these new states truly prepared? Were the civil services adequately staffed? The judiciary's independent? The army's professional? MacLeod's answer, delivered with characteristic directness, was that perfection was not on offer. The alternative to imperfect independence was continued occupation, and continued occupation had its own catastrophic costs. Costs Britain had already paid in blood and reputation in Kenya, in Cyprus, in Malaya. He was not wrong. He was also not entirely right. Kenya itself proved the most emotionally complicated of all these departures. 3 years of the Malayan Emergency had left deep wounds. Jomo Kenyatta had spent those years imprisoned, denounced by the colonial government as the dark hand behind the violence. When Kenya moved toward independence in 1963, his release and eventual leadership of the country seemed, to some British officials, almost incomprehensible. What followed instead was one of the most remarkable acts of political pragmatism in the entire history of decolonization. Kenyatta, emerging from imprisonment without a performance of bitterness, chose reconciliation with the settler community rather than retribution. He spoke of forgiveness, of building rather than dismantling, of a Kenya that would welcome those who accepted its sovereignty regardless of their origins. The white farmers who had expected expulsion found themselves, for the moment, invited to stay. His famous phrase that Kenya would bury the past with its face toward the future offered something genuine and astonishing, proof that the end of empire need not always produce the catastrophe that its defenders had predicted. Africa's cascade of independence carried within it both the promise of that reconciliation and the warning of Nigeria's fragile federalism. The next chapter of what empire left behind would be written not in London, but in the capitals of the nations that followed. The Central African Federation had always been a compromise that satisfied nobody completely. Created in 1953, it bound together northern Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia, and Nyasaland in an arrangement designed primarily to reassure the region's white settlers that their political dominance would survive the coming pressures of African nationalism. It did not survive them. By 1963, the Federation was finished. The African populations of northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland had made clear, through protest, petition, and the organizing genius of leaders like Hastings Banda in Nyasaland and Kenneth Kaunda in northern Rhodesia, that they would accept nothing short of majority rule. Britain, exhausted by the logic it had already applied across the continent, could not credibly refuse them. The dissolution came formally at the end of 1963. What followed was swift by the standards of colonial transition. Nyasaland became Malawi in July of 1964, with Banda as its first leader, a man whose authoritarian instincts would darken the country's future, but whose determination had broken the federation. Northern Rhodesia became Zambia in October of that same year, its vast copper deposits making it one of the wealthiest new states in Africa, Kenneth Kaunda its first president, his humane rhetoric offering genuine hope. Southern Rhodesia was different. It had always been different. Here, a white minority population of roughly 220,000 governed more than 4 million black Africans with no meaningful intention of sharing power. Southern Rhodesia had enjoyed a degree of self-government since 1923, far longer than most British territories. Its white settlers did not think of themselves as colonial administrators passing through. They thought of themselves as a permanent civilization, and they watched what was happening around them with something between fury and dread. Britain's position was straightforward in principle and agonizing in practice. There would be no independence without majority rule. No independence before majority rule, as the formula came to be known. The white government in Salisbury, led from 1964 by Ian Smith, a former Royal Air Force pilot with the measured manner of a man who had already decided everything, found this position intolerable. On the 11th of November 1965, Smith did something unprecedented in the modern history of the empire. He issued a unilateral declaration of independence, severing Rhodesia from British authority without consent, without negotiation, without majority rule. The document borrowed its language, almost mockingly, from the American Declaration of Independence. The irony was not subtle. What did Britain do? The answer, when examined honestly, is that Britain did very little. Prime Minister Harold Wilson rejected the use of military force categorically, fearing the response of British servicemen asked to fire on people of British descent and calculating that the economic costs of intervention outweighed the political benefits. Sanctions were imposed. They were ineffective. South Africa and Portugal, which then controlled neighboring Mozambique, refused to honor them. Rhodesia's rebellion became the unresolved wound of British decolonization, a festering reminder that when the interests of white settlers conflicted directly with the principles Britain had proclaimed, those principles bent. The country would not achieve genuine majority rule until 1980, after years of brutal guerrilla war under the name Zimbabwe. The contrast with Kenyatta's Kenya, with Kaunda's Zambia, with the orderly flags and careful ceremonies, could not have been more painful. Britain had managed, with difficulty and occasional dignity, to disentangle itself from much of Africa. In Rhodesia, it had simply looked away. The troubles of southern Africa would continue to haunt British foreign policy for decades. But elsewhere, the focus of decolonization was shifting toward a different ocean entirely, and a different set of inherited complications waiting in the Middle East and Asia. If Rhodesia represented Britain looking away, Aden represented Britain being driven out. The port city at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula had been a British possession since 1839, seized originally as a coaling station on the route to India. By the 1960s, it served a different purpose, anchoring Britain's entire military posture east of Suez, protecting oil routes from the Persian Gulf, and projecting power across a region still considered vital to national interest. Around it, Britain had constructed the Federation of South Arabia in 1963, stitching together Aden colony and a collection of tribal hinterland states into an arrangement intended to survive eventual British withdrawal in some managed friendly form. The Federation satisfied almost no one. Two insurgent movements emerged almost simultaneously, and they despised each other nearly as much as they despised the British. The National Liberation Front, backed by Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, drew its strength from the rural interior. The Front for the Liberation of Occupied South Yemen, known as Flossie, competed for control in the city itself. British soldiers found themselves caught between a nationalist insurgency and a factional civil war, facing grenade attacks, snipers, and bombings in the cramped alleyways of Aden's Crater District. The campaign became grimly attritional, costly in blood and reputation, and increasingly purposeless. The decisive blow came not on the streets of Aden but in a Whitehall document. The Defense White Paper of 1966, Harold Wilson's government facing severe economic pressure, announced that Britain would withdraw all military forces from east of Suez by the early 1970s. The announcement destroyed whatever remained of the Federation's credibility overnight. Why would local rulers align themselves with a power that had already announced its departure? The tribal leaders who had negotiated with Britain began negotiating instead with whoever seemed likely to win the coming struggle. By the autumn of 1967, the National Liberation Front had effectively won. The British evacuation, completed on the 30th of November, was hurried and undignified. The last High Commissioner departed without a formal handover ceremony. There was no flag, no grateful successor government, no careful transition. British troops filed onto aircraft and ships while the city they were leaving erupted into factional violence behind them. The new state, which would call itself the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, became the Arab world's only Marxist state, a Cold War footnote to Britain's retreat. Aden was not the largest jewel Britain had surrendered, nor the most populous territory. But its manner of going carried a particular weight. The hasty evacuation, broadcast on television screens across Britain, made visible what polite ceremony had obscured elsewhere. The empire east of Suez was not being honorably concluded. It was simply ending. And further east still, in the islands and territories stretching toward the Pacific, the same reckoning was arriving, wearing different faces but carrying the same inevitable logic. The humiliation of Aden had barely faded from newspaper front pages when a new crisis struck at the foundation of British economic confidence. On the 18th of November, 1967, Harold Wilson's government devalued the pound sterling by 14.3%, dropping its value against the dollar from $2.80 to $2.40. Wilson appeared on television that evening and made an assurance that would haunt him for years, insisting that the pound in British pockets had not lost its value. The British public, watching prices rise in the months that followed, drew their own conclusions. The devaluation was more than a financial embarrassment. It was a brutal clarification of Britain's actual position in the world. The country was spending roughly £300 million annually maintaining its military presence east of Suez, a commitment that could no longer be honestly reconciled with the state of the national accounts. Something had to give. It gave in January of 1968. Denise Healy, the defense secretary, delivered the announcement that strategists and politicians had been circling for years. Britain would withdraw all military forces from east of Suez by the end of 1971. The naval bases, the airfields, the garrison troops stationed across the Persian Gulf, Singapore, and Malaysia would all come home. The withdrawal was to be total, permanent, and accelerated beyond even the timelines previously discussed. The announcement sent tremors through the small states of the Persian Gulf, many of whom had existed for generations under British protection. Bahrain, Qatar, and the collection of coastal sheikdoms that Britain called the Trucial States had relied on British treaties and British guns to guarantee their borders and their rulers' thrones. Now that guarantee was being withdrawn. What followed was a remarkable piece of diplomatic improvisation. Britain worked to ensure these territories would not simply collapse into chaos or be absorbed by larger neighbors. Bahrain declared independence in August of 1971. Qatar followed in September. In December, 9 days before Britain's military withdrawal was complete, 6 of the Trucial States federated to form the United Arab Emirates, a nation assembled against the clock under British encouragement to fill the vacuum Britain itself was creating. Singapore and Malaysia faced the adjustment differently. Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew had warned for years that premature British withdrawal would be destabilizing, and he proved correct in his concern, though ultimately wrong in his pessimism. Both nations built their own defense arrangements, Singapore with particular urgency and particular success. The withdrawal east of Suez was completed on schedule. Britain had spent over a century as the dominant power across these waters, policing trade routes, settling disputes, and projecting authority from Aden to Hong Kong. Now that role was simply over, handed to no single successor, but dissolved into a more complicated world. What remained of the empire now existed primarily in the Caribbean and the scattered islands that decolonization had somehow not yet reached, waiting for their own moment of reckoning. The Caribbean had always occupied a peculiar place in the British imperial imagination. These islands had made fortunes for British merchants, planters, and investors across 3 centuries of sugar and slavery. By the early 1960s, they remained among the last significant territories awaiting their independence, and Britain was running out of reasons to delay. Jamaica and Trinidad moved first. On the 6th of August, 1962, Jamaica became an independent nation after over 300 years of British rule. Trinidad and Tobago followed 11 days later. Both ceremonies carried the familiar ritual of lowering the Union Jack and raising new flags, but both also carried a weight that independence celebrations elsewhere had not quite possessed. These were societies built on the forced labor of enslaved Africans, shaped by colonial extraction, and now expected to govern themselves with the institutions Britain left behind. The path to independence had actually begun more ambitiously. In 1958, Britain had attempted to bundle its Caribbean territories into a single West Indies federation, an arrangement that would have created one independent state from the scattered islands rather than a dozen small ones. The logic was sound in theory. The politics proved impossible in practice. Rivalry between Jamaica and Trinidad, disputes over taxation and freedom of movement, and the reluctance of larger islands to subsidize smaller ones tore the federation apart within 4 years. When Jamaica voted to leave in a referendum of 1961, Trinidad's Prime Minister Eric Williams offered the deadpan observation that 1 from 10 leaves 0. The federation dissolved, and each territory was left to negotiate its own future. Barbados followed in 1966, with the smaller islands finding their own paths through the late 1960s and into the 1970s. Guyana on the South American mainland had become independent in 1966. The Bahamas followed in 1973, Grenada in 1974, Dominica in 1978. The Eastern Caribbean islands emerged as some of the smallest sovereign nations on Earth. But the deepest connection between Britain and the Caribbean was being written not in independence ceremonies but in the streets of London, Birmingham, and Bristol. Long before formal independence arrived, Caribbean people had begun arriving in Britain itself. The Empire Windrush had docked at Tilbury in June of 1948, carrying nearly 500 passengers from Jamaica, and it became the symbol of a migration that brought hundreds of thousands to the mother country across the following 2 decades. They came because Britain invited them. Labor shortages in the post-war Reconstruction economy made Caribbean workers genuinely necessary, and their rights as British subjects gave them legal standing to arrive. What Britain's official invitation did not prepare them for was what actually awaited them. Signs reading "No Coloreds" appeared in boarding house windows. Factories and transport companies that publicly recruited in the Caribbean privately discriminated once workers arrived. The 1958 Notting Hill riots announced in the ugliest possible terms that a portion of the British public did not consider these new arrivals to belong. The Commonwealth Immigrants Act of 1962, passed the same year Jamaica gained its independence, began restricting the rights of entry that Caribbean migrants had legally held. The message was unmistakable. The Windrush generation had built lives, raised children, staffed the National Health Service, and driven London's buses. They had answered Britain's call. The question of whether Britain would honor its obligations to them would remain painfully unresolved for decades. The Caribbean sunset was unlike any other. Here the empire's end was not just about flags and constitutions, but about people, about the human consequences of what empire had created and what it now refused to fully acknowledge. Further west and further back in time waited yet another reckoning. Further west sat no new territory. The reckoning that awaited Britain was not across an ocean, but across a narrow strip of water, in a place Britain had never formally decolonized because it had never formally acknowledged it as a colony at all. Ireland was Britain's oldest colonial entanglement, stretching back to the 12th century. The Act of Union in 1800 had absorbed the entire island into the United Kingdom itself. Then, in 1922, most of Ireland broke free as the Irish Free State, but 6 counties in the northeast remained. Northern Ireland, with its Protestant Unionist majority and its Catholic nationalist minority, stayed British. The border drawn then was not a solution. It was a postponement. By the late 1960s, the postponement had run out. Northern Ireland's Catholic minority lived under systematic discrimination. Housing allocations favored Protestants. Electoral boundaries were drawn to dilute Catholic votes. The police force, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, was overwhelmingly Protestant and widely distrusted by nationalist communities. Anyone who had watched the civil rights movement in the American South would have recognized the landscape immediately. In 1968, inspired directly by that movement, Catholic activists began marching for equal rights. They were met with batons. The parallels to colonial conflicts elsewhere were impossible to miss. A minority population denied equal standing in their own land, demanding rights within a system designed to exclude them. Britain had seen this pattern in Kenya, in Malaya, in Cyprus. The difference was that this time the territory in question was, constitutionally speaking, part of Britain itself. In August of 1969, as communal violence between Protestant and Catholic neighborhoods reached a pitch the local authorities could no longer contain, the British government deployed soldiers onto the streets of Belfast and Derry. The troops arrived initially as protectors of the Catholic population. Within 2 years, they were viewed by that same population as an occupying force. The distance between those two positions collapsed on a single afternoon. On the 30th of January 1972, British paratroopers opened fire on a civil rights march in the Bogside neighborhood of Derry. They killed 14 unarmed civilians. Bloody Sunday did not simply inflame the conflict. It transformed it. The provisional IRA, already active, now found recruits lining up. Any possibility that Northern Ireland's Catholics might be persuaded that reform within the British system was achievable burned in the streets of Derry that January day. Westminster responded by suspending the Northern Ireland Parliament at Stormont and imposing direct rule from London in March of 1972. Britain was now governing the province directly, a situation that would last, with brief interruptions, for over 2 decades. The 30 years that followed were called simply the Troubles, a characteristically understated name for a conflict that killed over 3,500 people. Bombs detonated in Birmingham, Brighton, Canary Wharf, and the City of London. The violence that empire had so often exported came home to British streets. What made Northern Ireland so uniquely painful in the story of British decolonization was precisely that it was never called decolonization at all. No independence ceremony was planned. No flag was prepared to replace the Union Jack. The imperial entanglement here was so old, so deep, and so embedded in British constitutional identity that the tools Britain had used elsewhere simply did not apply. The Good Friday Agreement of April 1998 finally offered a framework for peace, acknowledging the complexity that force had never resolved. The empire had always promised civilization and order. In Northern Ireland, it had delivered neither to those it claimed as its own. While Britain wrestled with its oldest colonial wound, another unfinished chapter was grinding toward its conclusion on the African continent. Rhodesia had been a problem without a solution for 15 years. By the early 1970s, it was becoming a war. Ian Smith's white minority government, which had declared unilateral independence from Britain in 1965, governed a country of roughly 6 million black Africans and 250,000 white settlers. The settlers held the land, the courts, and the guns. But they were running out of time. The Bush War, which the liberation movements called Chimurenga, escalated sharply after 1972. 2 armed movements pressed inward from neighboring territories. The Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, the military wing of Robert Mugabe's ZNU, operated from Mozambique after that country's independence in 1975. The Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army pressed from Zambia in the west. By the late 1970s, rural Rhodesia was a battlefield. Smith's forces were skilled and ruthless, but they were fighting the arithmetic of a country that was overwhelmingly black, overwhelmingly young, and overwhelmingly committed to majority rule. International pressure tightened the noose. Sanctions had bitten since the late 1960s. South Africa, Rhodesia's most important economic lifeline, grew increasingly reluctant to prop up a regime that was becoming an embarrassment even to Pretoria. The United States, the United Nations, and the entire Commonwealth demanded movement. Smith's answer was the internal settlement of March 1978, a compromise that satisfied almost nobody. He negotiated with moderate black leaders, most notably Bishop Abel Muzorewa, bypassing the guerrilla movements entirely. Elections in April 1979 produced a government under Muzorewa, and the country was briefly renamed Zimbabwe Rhodesia. It was majority rule in form, but not in substance. White Rhodesians retained extraordinary constitutional protections, and the war continued without pause. No foreign government recognized the new arrangement. The guerrillas fought on. It was at this impasse that Britain, under the newly elected government of Margaret Thatcher, made a decisive intervention. The Lancaster House Conference opened in London in September 1979, bringing together Smith, Muzorewa, Mugabe, and Joshua Nkomo of ZAPU under British chairmanship. Lord Carrington, the Foreign Secretary, drove the negotiations with a combination of pressure and pragmatism. After nearly 3 months of difficult talks, all parties signed an agreement in December 1979. The agreement was imperfect, as all such agreements are. It guaranteed white Rhodesians 20 seats in Parliament for 7 years and protected existing property rights, meaning the deeply unequal land distribution that had fueled the conflict was largely preserved for the moment. But it ended the war, scheduled free elections, and established a path to genuine independence. Those elections, held in February 1980, delivered a result that startled many Western observers who had hoped for a more moderate outcome. Robert Mugabe's ZANUPF won 57 of 80 common roll seats in a landslide. The man Britain had imprisoned, dismissed, and feared would be governing Zimbabwe. On the 18th of April 1980, the Union Jack came down in Salisbury, soon to be renamed Harare. Zimbabwe became independent. The crowd that gathered for the ceremony numbered in the tens of thousands. Bob Marley performed. A continent watched. It was the last major act of African decolonization. The journey from the scramble for Africa in the 1880s to that April night in Harare had taken almost exactly a century. But Africa was not quite the final page. Scattered across the globe, smaller territories remained, each carrying its own unresolved questions about what Britain owed the people it had once claimed as subjects. The ink on the Zimbabwe independence documents was barely dry before history delivered one of its stranger reversals. 2 years after the last major African decolonization, Britain found itself fighting a colonial war of an entirely different kind, not to relinquish territory, but to reclaim it. On the 2nd of April 1982, Argentine military forces invaded the Falkland Islands, a remote British territory in the South Atlantic, roughly 300 miles off the Patagonian coast. The islands held fewer than 2,000 inhabitants, several hundred thousand sheep, and almost no strategic value in any conventional military sense. Argentina called them the Malvinas and had claimed them for generations. Britain had held them since 1833. Margaret Thatcher's response was swift and unambiguous. Within days of the invasion, she ordered the assembly of a naval task force. 100 ships and 28,000 personnel began the 8,000-mile journey south. The decision stunned many observers. Britain had spent 30 years systematically withdrawing from empire. It had closed bases, cut budgets, and repeatedly signaled that the era of military projection was finished. And yet here was the Royal Navy, steaming toward the bottom of the world. Why? The question nagged at commentators then and still resonates today. The official answer was the right of the Falkland Islanders to self-determination, a principle that carried genuine moral weight. But critics noted the paradox sharply. The same government invoking self-determination had previously proposed a sovereignty transfer deal with Argentina. The same Britain that had peacefully surrendered India, Ghana, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe was now going to war over a windswept archipelago with a population smaller than many English market towns. The war lasted 74 days. British forces landed at San Carlos Bay on the 21st of May, fighting across difficult terrain against Argentine conscripts who were, in many cases, poorly supplied and poorly led. The cost was real. 255 British servicemen died, along with 649 Argentines and 3 Falkland Islanders. Ships were sunk by French-built Exocet missiles. The fighting was neither quick nor bloodless. Argentine forces surrendered on the 14th of June, 1982. Thatcher's political fortunes, which had been struggling badly, were transformed overnight. The Falklands factor would help carry her to a landslide victory in the following year's election. But the deeper meaning of the conflict was harder to parse. The Falklands was not decolonization. It was, in a sense, its mirror image. It suggested that empire did not end cleanly or logically. It ended in layers, leaving behind scattered fragments, tiny populations with complicated loyalties, and unresolved claims that could, under the right circumstances, still produce real bloodshed. The Falkland Islands remain British today, their residents overwhelmingly in favor of that arrangement. They stand as a postscript, a reminder that the map of empire does not simply dissolve. Some pieces linger, each carrying its own particular weight of history. And as Britain absorbed this strange, anachronistic conflict, the deeper question of what the empire had left behind, across every continent, was only beginning to be fully reckoned with. No territory Britain ever held carried quite the weight of Hong Kong. Not for its size, not for its population alone, but for what it represented. The last major piece, the final page of an imperial story that had taken 3 centuries to write. The framework for ending it arrived in 1984. After 2 years of tense negotiations, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and Chinese Premier Zhao Ziyang signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration in Beijing. The terms were stark and unambiguous. On the 1st of July 1997, sovereignty over Hong Kong would transfer to the People's Republic of China. In exchange, Beijing promised something remarkable. For 50 years following the handover, Hong Kong would retain its own legal system, its freedoms, its capitalist economy. One country, 2 systems. Many in Hong Kong read the fine print with unease. The promise was genuine on paper. Whether it would hold in practice depended entirely on the goodwill of a government that had, just 5 years before the handover, sent tanks into Tiananmen Square. Into this atmosphere of anxious anticipation stepped Christopher Patten, appointed as Hong Kong's last governor in 1992. Patten was unlike his predecessors. A career politician rather than a colonial administrator, he arrived with democratic instincts and a politician's instinct for legacy. And he immediately did something that threw Beijing into fury. He proposed expanding the democratic franchise in Hong Kong's elections, widening the vote to include ordinary workers, broadening representation in ways that had never been attempted during 150 years of British rule. The timing was not lost on anyone. Britain had governed Hong Kong as a colony without meaningful democracy for a century and a half. Now, with 5 years remaining, it was suddenly interested in democratic reform. Beijing condemned the move as a deliberate provocation, a betrayal of the spirit of the Joint Declaration. Chinese officials warned that any patent reforms would be dismantled the moment sovereignty transferred. The two sides stopped speaking directly. Patton pressed forward regardless, and the reforms passed. Whether they represented genuine principle or a calculated parting gesture, history continues to debate. By the evening of the 30th of June, 1997, the reckoning had arrived. Rain fell heavily over Hong Kong Harbor as the ceremony began. More than 4,000 guests gathered beneath the gleaming roof of the new convention center. Television cameras broadcast the moment to an estimated 500 million viewers worldwide. Prince Charles stood in the humid air alongside the last governor, watching with visible solemnity. Chinese President Jiang Zemin sat across the ceremonial divide, his expression carefully composed. At the stroke of midnight, the Union Jack came down. The 5-starred red flag of the People's Republic rose in its place. 156 years of British rule ended in a single, choreographed moment. The British delegation boarded the royal yacht Britannia and sailed out through the harbor into the South China Sea. Many of those watching, British and Hong Kongese alike, wept openly. It was not entirely clear what they were mourning. An empire? A city? A certain idea of what the future might have been? The promise of one country, two systems would last, officially, until 2047. But by 2020, Beijing had imposed a sweeping national security law on the territory, effectively redefining the boundaries of Hong Kong's promised freedoms long before that deadline arrived. The faces of the 1997 ceremony, the handshakes, the careful diplomatic smiles, took on a different quality in retrospect. And so the British Empire ended not with a declaration of war, not with a negotiated treaty in some grand European capital, but with rain falling on a harbor, a flag descending in the tropical night, and a ship sailing quietly into the dark water. 3 decades of dissolution, from Indian independence in 1947 to this final harbor farewell, had remade the entire world. The question that remained, the one historians and policymakers are still answering today, is what that world actually inherited from the empire that shaped it. After the rain fell on Hong Kong Harbor and Britannia sailed into the dark, the British Empire was finished. Or was it? Scattered across the world's oceans, 14 territories still fly the Union Jack. Not colonies, not dominions, not protectorates. Since the British Overseas Territories Act of 2002, they carry a carefully chosen name, one that implies partnership rather than possession. Together they amount to roughly 6,000 square miles of land and a combined population of around 270,000 people. The sun, in a technical sense, still never sets on British sovereignty. They are an improbable collection. Gibraltar, that narrow limestone promontory guarding the entrance to the Mediterranean, has been British since 1713 and has voted twice, in 1967 and again in 2002, to remain so. Spain still wants it back. The Gibraltarians still refuse. The territory became a particular flashpoint during Brexit negotiations, when its unique position straddling the European border suddenly made its status a matter of urgent diplomatic arithmetic. Further south and west lie the Falkland Islands, whose name alone carries the weight of a war. 347 British servicemen died retaking them in 1982. Argentina has never formally abandoned its claim. In 2013, the Falkland Islanders voted on their future with remarkable clarity. 1,513 votes to remain British, 3 against. The oil beneath the surrounding seabed ensures the dispute will not grow quieter anytime soon. Then there are the places most people could not locate on a map. Pitcairn Island, population somewhere around 50, the remote Pacific home of the descendants of the Bounty mutineers. St. Helena, where Napoleon Bonaparte spent his final exile, accessible until 2016 only by a single mail ship. Tristan da Cunha, the most remote inhabited island on Earth, sitting in the South Atlantic nearly 1,700 miles from the nearest continental coastline. Each territory has its own constitutional arrangement, its own elected government, its own relationship with London. None is governed as a colony in the Victorian sense. Residents hold British overseas territory citizenship, though the right to live and work in Britain itself has varied considerably across different legislation and different decades. The tension at the heart of all 14 territories is a genuine one. The United Nations still lists most of them on its register of non-self-governing territories, formally requiring decolonization. Yet the populations of Gibraltar, the Falklands, and the Cayman Islands have made their wishes abundantly clear through democratic votes. Self-determination, in these cases, points toward remaining British rather than away from it. What does an empire leave behind when it dissolves? Sometimes borders drawn without wisdom. Sometimes institutions that outlasted their designers. And sometimes on a windswept Atlantic island or a Mediterranean rock, the simple and stubborn preference of people who have decided, given the choice, where they belong. What do you call an empire that no longer rules but refuses to disappear entirely? The British Commonwealth offers one answer, and it is a complicated one. By 1949, the old formula was already straining. When India chose to become a republic, retaining no formal allegiance to the crown, British officials faced a choice. Insist on loyalty to the monarch and lose the subcontinent entirely, or reinvent the whole arrangement? They chose reinvention. The London Declaration of that year quietly transformed the British Commonwealth of Nations into simply the Commonwealth of Nations, with the British monarch recognized merely as a symbol of free association rather than a sovereign authority. Empire had become a club, and membership was now voluntary. 56 nations belong to that club today, representing roughly 2.5 billion people across every inhabited continent. On paper, it is an extraordinary network. In practice, its power has always been contested. The Commonwealth's most significant test came during the long crisis over apartheid South Africa and the parallel struggle over Rhodesia. Britain, protective of white minority interests and wary of economic disruption, found itself repeatedly at odds with African and Caribbean member states demanding stronger action. The tension nearly tore the organization apart. South Africa left in 1961. Rhodesia's unilateral declaration of independence in 1965 forced years of painful negotiation, eventually resolved only in 1980 when Zimbabwe emerged as an independent state. Through it all, the Commonwealth revealed something important about itself. It could generate enormous moral pressure without possessing the mechanisms to enforce anything. The question of the monarchy has grown louder in recent decades. 14 Commonwealth realms still recognize the British monarch as head of state, but that number has been declining. When Barbados removed the Queen and became a republic in November 2021, the ceremony in Bridgetown carried extraordinary symbolic weight. Rihanna was declared a national hero. The last vestiges of colonial imagery were formally retired. Prime Minister Mia Mottley called it the logical conclusion of a journey begun at independence. More nations, including Jamaica and Belize, are watching and considering. Does the Commonwealth matter? Its defenders point to shared legal traditions, educational links, trade relationships, and the genuine warmth of the Commonwealth Games. Its critics argue it remains a vehicle for British soft power dressed in the language of partnership, a structure that reinforces inequalities rather than addressing them, particularly regarding reparations for slavery and colonial exploitation. Both arguments contain truth. The Commonwealth is neither the empire rebranded nor the equal partnership its brochures suggest. It exists somewhere in between, shaped by history it cannot escape and a future it has not yet defined. The empire dissolved in 30 years of handovers, independence ceremonies, and lowered flags. What it left behind was not nothing. It was something harder to name, and perhaps harder still to judge. The full accounting, as any honest historian will concede, remains unfinished. The borders drawn in haste have outlasted everything else. The lines Cyril Radcliffe sketched across Punjab and Bengal in the summer of 1947, completed in 5 weeks by a man who had never visited India, produced a partition that killed perhaps 1 million peoples and displaced 12 to 14 million more. The dispute over Kashmir that emerged from that same rushed settlement has never been resolved. 3 wars, decades of insurgency, and 2 nuclear-armed nations still face each other across a line of control that Radcliffe never intended to be permanent. He reportedly never spoke about the partition publicly for the rest of his life. Palestine tells a similar story. The British Mandate ended in May 1948 with no agreed solution, no enforceable boundary, and no protection for the Arab population that had been promised consideration alongside the Jewish homeland. The conflict that followed has consumed generations. Cyprus, partitioned after intercommunal violence in the 1960s and a Turkish invasion in 1974, remains physically divided to this day, its capital Nicosia the last divided city in Europe. These are not ancient grievances. They are active wounds, and their origins traced directly to imperial decisions made in London conference rooms by officials who were simultaneously trying to withdraw from the world they had built. The human consequences of empire arrived in Britain itself, and not always with a welcome. When the HMT Empire Windrush docked at Tilbury in June 1948, its passengers were British subjects arriving from the Caribbean, invited to help rebuild a country devastated by war. They had every legal right to be there. Decades later, the British government would lose the landing records of that generation, then threaten thousands with deportation, detention, and denial of health care, despite their having lived and worked and paid taxes in Britain for most of their lives. The Windrush scandal, exposed fully in 2018, revealed something the empire's admirers preferred not to examine: that the people who came from the colonies were, in Britain's institutional imagination, never quite supposed to stay. The arguments over memory have grown louder in the years since. The Rhodes Must Fall movement, which began in Cape Town in 2015 and spread to Oxford the following year, forced a public reckoning with the statues, buildings, and endowments that commemorate the architects of empire. When the statue of slave trader Edward Colston was pulled from its plinth in Bristol in 2020 and dropped into the harbor, it triggered a culture war that has not subsided. Some see the removal of such monuments as an erasure of history. Others argue that a statue is not a history lesson but an honor, and that the distinction matters enormously. What has been genuinely erased is harder to see and less debated. Operation Legacy, the systematic destruction and concealment of colonial records carried out as Britain withdrew from its territories between the 1950s and 1970s, ensured that the full documentary record of what was done in the Empire's name would never be complete. Files were burned, weighted, and dropped into the ocean, or quietly migrated to archives that remained classified for decades. So has the British Empire truly ended? The flags came down. The ceremonies were held. The maps were redrawn. But the borders remain, the disputes persist. The descendants of empire navigate a Britain that still debates what it owes them and what it wishes to forget. Empires do not end. They transform, leaving their consequences to those who never chose to inherit them, and asking a question that no generation yet has fully answered. The British Empire's dissolution reshaped every corner of the modern world, and its echoes in borders, identities, and unresolved debts continue to define our present. Subscribe for more histories that explain how we got here.